1892 family portrait discovered, and historians stop cold when they see what is resting beside the chair. The photograph reached the Boston Historical Society on a chilly Tuesday morning in March 2024, placed inside a battered cardboard box along with 17 other items donated from the estate of a late collector. Sarah Mitchell, a curator who focused on 19th-century American photography, nearly overlooked it completely. She had spent hours sorting through tintypes and cabinet cards, her eyes strained from studying faded faces and fragile paper, when she pulled out a stiff cardboard backing protecting what seemed to be an ordinary Victorian family photograph. The image measured 8 by 10 inches and was mounted on thick cream-colored cardstock, with the photographer's name pressed in worn gold lettering along the bottom. J. Morrison Studio, Boston, Massachusetts, 1892. Sarah placed it beneath the magnifying lamp on her desk and leaned closer. 5 figures stared back at her with the stiff, unsmiling expressions common to that time period. A bearded man in his late 30s sat in an ornate wooden chair, one hand resting on the arm. A woman stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, wearing a dark, severe dress with a high neckline. 3 children were arranged around them, 2 boys and a girl, all pale, faced and serious. Sarah had examined hundreds of portraits just like this one. They were glimpses into lives long ended, silent records of families who spent valuable money to preserve their likenesses for the future. Most offered no story beyond what was visible, but something about this photograph made her hesitate. She adjusted the lamp and leaned in further. The image quality was unusually sharp for a photograph from 1892. The details were clear despite more than a century of age. She could make out the texture of the man's wool suit, the fine lace collar on the woman's dress, even the individual buttons on the children's clothing. Then her eyes moved to the floor beside the man's chair, towards something she had first dismissed as a shadow caused by studio lighting. It was not a shadow. Partly visible beside the carved leg of the chair, almost hidden beneath the edge of a small decorative rug, was an object that did not belong in a formal Victorian portrait. Sarah caught her breath. She reached for her digital scanner, her hands suddenly shaky. She needed a higher resolution image. She needed to be completely sure of what she was seeing, because if she was correct, this simple photograph held an extraordinary story that had stayed hidden for 132 years. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she placed the photograph onto the flatbed scanner. The machine came to life with a low hum, its light bar moving beneath the glass with mechanical accuracy. She set the resolution to 1200 dpi, much higher than normal archival standards, but she needed to see every fiber, every shadow, every detail the Morrison Studio had captured in 1892. When the scan finished, she opened the file on her computer and zoomed in on the area beside the chair. The image blurred for a moment, then came into focus. Sarah leaned so close to the screen her nose nearly touched it. There, partly concealed by the rug and the shadow of the chair, was a small cloth doll. It looked roughly made, clearly handmade, with a simple dress and what appeared to be yarn hair. The fabric seemed worn, used, loved, but what made Sarah's pulse race was not the doll itself. Toys like this were common in the 1890s. It was where it had been placed. Victorian portrait photography was costly and highly formal. Families often saved for months to afford a session at a respected studio. Every detail was planned: the furniture, the clothing, the posture, the lighting. Props were sometimes included: a book, a watch chain, a piece of jewelry, but these were always intentional, always positioned to show status or personality. A worn child's toy would never be carelessly left on the floor of a formal portrait. Never, unless someone wanted it there. Sarah pulled out her reference books on Victorian photography practices and spent the next hour confirming what her instincts already told her. In hundreds of family portraits from the 1890s, she found no example of a toy casually placed on the studio floor. When children's items appeared at all, they were held properly, displayed clearly, or carefully arranged on furniture. This doll had been placed deliberately where it would be barely noticeable, present but not obvious. Someone wanted it in the photograph, but did not want it to dominate the scene. The question was why. Sarah returned to the image and studied the three children more closely. The two boys, perhaps 8 and 10 years old, stood on either side of their father, hands clasped in front of them, their expressions calm and controlled. But the girl, the youngest, maybe 5 years old, stood slightly apart, positioned between her mother and the older boy. Her hand rested in her mother's, yet something about her posture seemed different, more rigid, less certain. Sarah grabbed a notepad and wrote down the photographer's name and studio address. Tomorrow, she would begin searching city records. Someone in this photograph had a story waiting to be told, and that worn cloth doll was the key to uncovering it. The Boston City Archives filled 3 floors of a converted warehouse in the North End, its climate. Controlled rooms packed with leather-bound ledgers, fragile newspapers, and filing cabinets containing the documented lives of millions. Sarah arrived as the doors opened at 9, carrying the photograph, her laptop, and a thermos of coffee she knew she would need. She began with the Morrison studio records. To her relief, the photographer had been well known enough that several business ledgers had survived and been preserved. She located the 1892 appointment book within an hour. Its pages were yellowed but readable, filled with neat handwritten entries listing each sitting, every client, and each payment. She ran her finger down the September entries, then October, then November. There it was, November 14, 1892. Thomas and Elizabeth Harper, family portrait, 5 subjects, payment received in full, $350. Sarah carefully copied the names, Thomas and Elizabeth Harper. She now had identities for the man and woman in the photograph. But who were the 3 children? And more importantly, why were only 2 usually listed in records? She moved on to the birth records, pulling heavy volumes from 1882 to 1890, searching for any children born to Thomas and Elizabeth Harper. The work was slow, each page requiring close attention to handwritten entries that had faded with time. After 2 hours, she found them. James Harper, born March 1884. Robert Harper, born June 1886. 2 sons. Only 2. Sarah leaned back, her thoughts racing. The photograph clearly showed 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, yet official birth records showed only 2 sons. There was no daughter, no third child recorded at all. She returned to the image on her laptop and zoomed in on the little girl's face. The child was clearly present, standing with the family, her hand held by Elizabeth Harper, yet she did not exist in any official document. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon searching death records, marriage records, immigration files, and census data. She found Thomas Harper listed in the 1890 census as a supervisor at the Waltham textile mill, living at 47 Cedar Street with his wife Elizabeth and 2 sons. No daughter, no third child. As the archives prepared to close for the day, Sarah gathered her materials, her mind filled with questions. A family does not include a child in an expensive formal portrait if that child is not part of the family. And yet this girl, standing among them, marked only by a worn cloth doll on the studio floor, had left no trace in official history. Sarah looked at the photograph one last time before putting it away. "Who were you?" she thought, studying the serious face of the unnamed girl. "And why did someone want to remove you from history?" Sarah returned to the archives the following morning with a new plan. If the girl was not a biological daughter, perhaps she was connected in another way, a niece, a ward, or an informally adopted child. Such arrangements were more common in the 1890s than records suggested, especially among working families. She decided to look deeper into Thomas Harper's employment at the Waltham textile mill. Factory records often contained details that census data did not. Employee lists, accident reports, and even personal notes from supervisors. The mill records were stored in a separate section under Industrial History. Sarah requested boxes covering 1890 to 1895 and settled at a corner table to work through them carefully. After an hour, she found Thomas Harper's employment file. He had worked at the mill since 1881, starting as a floor worker and rising to supervisor by 1889, a promotion that explained how the family could afford the portrait. His file included yearly evaluations, all positive, describing him as dependable, hardworking, and well-respected by his crew. Then, tucked between two quarterly reports from 1891, she found a newspaper clipping placed inside the file. The paper was brittle, the ink faded brown, but the headline was still clear. Tragedy at Waltham Mill, 5 dead in boiler room fire. Sarah's hands went still as she read. She moved through the article slowly, her chest tightening with each paragraph. On January 18, 1891, a boiler failure had caused an explosion in the mill basement, leading to a fire that spread quickly through the lower floors. 5 workers died, trapped when a stairwell collapsed. The article listed their names: Patrick Brennan, age 34, Michael Donovan, 28, Catherine Riley, 29, Sean Murphy, 41, and Margaret Sullivan, 27. The article continued with details of desperate rescue efforts. Several workers risked their lives pulling others from the burning building. One name appeared again and again: Thomas Harper, who had been supervising the morning shift and repeatedly entered the building to search for trapped workers. Sarah felt her pulse speed up. She read on, searching for more information. Near the end of the article, almost as a side note, was a brief line: Mrs. Sullivan leaves behind a daughter, age 4, whose whereabouts and care remain uncertain. Sarah carefully set the clipping down, her mind linking pieces scattered across more than a century. Margaret Sullivan, a textile worker, killed in a fire, leaving a 4-year-old daughter in January 1891. The photograph was taken in November 1892, nearly 2 years later. The girl in the portrait looked about 5 or 6 years old. Sarah pulled out her notebook and began calculating dates, matching them against the birth records she had reviewed the day before. If Margaret Sullivan's daughter had been 4 years old in January 1891, then she would have been born around 1886 or 1887. That meant she would have been about 5 years old in November 1892, when the Harper family portrait was taken. Sarah spent the weekend researching everything she could find about Margaret Sullivan and the 1891 textile mill fire. The disaster had been serious enough to appear in several Boston newspapers, and Sarah located 3 additional articles that gave more information about the victims and what followed. Margaret Sullivan had been a widow. Her husband had died from pneumonia in 1889, leaving her alone to care for herself and her young daughter. She worked the early morning shift at the mill, starting at 5:00 a.m., which explained why her daughter had not been with her when the fire occurred. The article stated that neighbors had taken care of the child immediately afterward, but none explained what happened to her in the long run. On Monday morning, Sarah went to the Massachusetts State Archives to search through orphanage records. Boston had several institutions that cared for children in the 1890s, including the Home for Little Wanderers, the Boston Female Asylum, and the House of the Angel Guardian. If Margaret Sullivan's daughter had been placed in any official home, there should have been a record. Sarah reviewed admission logs from January through December 1891, looking for any girl about 4 years old admitted in the weeks after the fire. The names she read were painful. Dozens of children left by desperate parents, picked up from the streets, or orphaned by illness and accidents. But she did not find a single admission that matched Margaret Sullivan's daughter by date or situation. Sarah leaned back in her chair, frustrated but more confident than ever about what had likely happened. The child had not been sent to an orphanage because someone had taken her in privately, someone who had been at the mill during the fire, someone who had seen the tragedy with their own eyes and felt a sense of responsibility. Thomas Harper. Sarah returned again to the photograph, studying it with new understanding. The little girl's worn cloth doll, barely noticeable beside the chair. Had the doll been made by Margaret Sullivan herself? Was it the only item the child brought with her from her former life into her new one? Sarah decided she needed to track down the Harper family's residential records. If Thomas and Elizabeth had taken in Margaret Sullivan's daughter, there might be evidence in neighborhood documents, church files, or school enrollment records. She spent the afternoon at the Boston Public Library, going through school enrollment lists for the Cedar Street area. Many records from the 1890s were incomplete, and some schools kept poor documentation. Still, she finally found something encouraging in the files for Cedar Street Primary School. The enrollment register for the 1892-1893 school year listed 3 children from the Harper household at 47 Cedar Street: James Harper, age 8, Robert Harper, age 6, and Anna Harper, age 5. Anna Harper. The name did not appear in any birth records or census data before 1892. She seemed to appear suddenly in the Harper household sometime between the 1890 census and the 1892 school year. Sarah felt everything starting to make sense. Thomas and Elizabeth Harper had taken in Margaret Sullivan's daughter after the fire and raised her as their own. They had given her their last name, they had enrolled her in school as their child, and they had included her in their formal family portrait with only a small cloth doll, her mother's final gift, to quietly mark where she truly came from. Sarah knew documents alone were not enough. She needed background, personal stories, the kind of information that never appeared in official records. She decided to reach out to local historical societies in Waltham and nearby neighborhoods where mill workers had lived during the 1890s. Her message to the Waltham Historical Society led to a reply from their volunteer coordinator, Dorothy. Dorothy explained that while they had limited written records about individual mill workers, they did maintain an oral history collection with recorded interviews from descendants of mill employees. She invited Sarah to visit their small museum and research library. Sarah drove to Waltham on a rainy Thursday morning. The Historical Society was housed in a converted Victorian home on Main Street, its rooms filled with photographs, artifacts, and filing cabinets full of collected memories. Dorothy, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and sharp, observant eyes, greeted her at the door. "You mentioned the 1891 fire in your email," she said as she led Sarah to a back room lined with shelves. "That event left deep marks on this community. Many families lost someone that day." She pulled out a binder filled with interview transcripts recorded in the 1970s and 1980s from elderly residents who had grown up in the mill district. These people were children in the 1890s and early 1900s, Dorothy explained. Their memories aren't always exact with dates, but they remember the stories their parents told them. Sarah spent hours reading through the transcripts, looking for any reference to the Harper family or the fire. Most accounts focused on working conditions, daily routines, and the general hardships of mill life. Then, in an interview from 1979 with a woman named Helen, born in 1895, Sarah found something extraordinary. The interviewer had asked Helen about families she remembered from her childhood neighborhood. Her response, recorded word for word, included this statement: "The Harpers lived 2 houses down from us on Cedar Street. Mr. Harper was well-liked, a fair supervisor. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. My mother said the girl wasn't theirs by birth, but they loved her all the same. Mother said Mrs. Harper felt terrible for the child after her real mother died in that awful fire. They took her in when others wouldn't and raised her as their own. Nobody spoke about it much. Back then, you didn't ask questions like that, but everyone knew and everyone respected them for it." Sarah read the passage 3 times, her eyes stinging with sudden emotion. Everyone knew. The neighborhood had known that Anna was not the Harpers' biological child, but they protected the truth, allowing the family to raise her without judgment or interference. Dorothy stood beside her, reading quietly. "It wasn't unusual," she said softly. "Formal adoptions were costly and difficult in the 1890s. Many families took in orphan children informally, especially if there was a connection through work or church. People accepted it and carried on." Sarah showed Dorothy the photograph she had brought. The older woman examined it carefully, then pointed to the cloth doll near the chair. "That says a lot," she said. "They didn't deny where she came from. They honored it in their own way. That doll was likely the only thing she had left from her mother." With Anna's name confirmed and her connection to Margaret Sullivan clear, Sarah returned to Boston, determined to learn what happened to the child after the photograph was taken. She wanted to know if the Harpers continued to raise her, if she lived a full life, if their kindness truly gave her a future. She began with the 1900 census and found the Harper family still living at 47 Cedar Street. Thomas Harper, age 45, mill supervisor; Elizabeth Harper, age 42, James Harper, age 16, Robert Harper, age 14, and Anna Harper, age 13, listed as daughter. The census recorded her simply as their child. There was no note about adoption, no special mark, no explanation. In official records, she was Anna Harper, a full member of the family. Sarah followed the trail through later census records. By 1910, James and Robert had left home and were working at factories around Boston. Anna, now 23, was still living with Thomas and Elizabeth and working as a seamstress, a skilled job that suggested she had received proper education and training. Then Sarah found Anna's marriage record. Anna Harper married Joseph Mitchell on June 12, 1912, at St. Mary's Church in Waltham. The document listed her father as Thomas Harper. There was no mention of her birth name and no reference to Margaret Sullivan. Sarah felt a tight knot form in her throat. The Harpers had given this orphan child more than shelter. They had given her a name, an identity, and a future. They allowed her to become someone beyond the girl whose mother died in the fire. She continued tracing Anna's life through the years. City directories showed Anna and Joseph living in Cambridge, where Joseph worked as a postal clerk. Birth records showed that Anna and Joseph had 4 children between 1913 and 1921. Anna appeared in the census records of 1920, 1930, and 1940. Her life was recorded in the same simple way as millions of others: marriages, home addresses, jobs, and children. Sarah later found Anna's death certificate, dated 1967. Anna had died at the age of 80 in her daughter's home in Arlington from natural causes. The certificate listed her parents as Thomas and Elizabeth Harper. Sarah sat quietly in the archive room, staring at the document. Anna had lived for 76 years after the photograph was taken. She had been raised by people who chose to love her, who accepted social judgment and financial strain to give her a family. She married, raised children, and lived long enough to see grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She died not as Margaret Sullivan's orphan child, but as Anna Harper Mitchell, surrounded by the family that existed because of one act of kindness in 1891. The photograph had not simply recorded a family. It had captured a rescue, a change of fate, and a love that carried forward through generations. Sarah knew the story was still unfinished. Since Anna lived until 1967 and had 4 children, there was a strong chance her descendants were still alive. They deserved to know the truth about their great-grandmother's beginnings and what the photograph truly represented. Sarah began with the obituary. Anna's death notice in an Arlington newspaper listed her surviving children, Catherine, Margaret, Thomas, and Elizabeth. Sarah paused when she noticed the names, chosen after the Harpers and Anna's birth mother. The obituary mentioned grandchildren, but did not list them all. Using genealogy tools and public records, Sarah began building Anna's family tree. Working forward from 1967, she learned that Catherine had 3 children, Margaret had 2, Thomas had 5, and Elizabeth had 3. In total, Anna had 13 grandchildren, most born between 1935 and 1960. After days of research and cross-checking phone books, public records, and social media, Sarah identified 6 grandchildren who were still living, now in their 70s and 80s. She wrote a careful letter explaining who she was, describing the photograph, and asking if any of them would be willing to speak with her. 2 weeks later, she received a phone call from a woman named Patricia, who introduced herself as Anna's granddaughter, the daughter of Thomas Mitchell. Patricia's voice sounded warm and curious. "Your letter surprised me," she said. "I knew my grandmother was very close to the Harper family, but I never understood the full story. She rarely talked about her childhood." They agreed to meet at a cafe in Cambridge the following Saturday. Patricia arrived carrying a worn leather folder. She was tall, with silver hair and eyes that looked just like Anna's. Sarah recognized them immediately, the same serious, thoughtful gaze from the photograph. "I brought a few things," Patricia said as she carefully opened the folder. "After I got your letter, I went through boxes my mother left behind. I found these." She placed 3 items on the table. The first was a small photograph similar in style to the Harper portrait, showing Anna on her wedding day in 1912. The second was a handwritten letter from 1935 that Anna had written to her daughter Margaret, talking about family history. The third item, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, was a small cloth doll with yarn hair and a simple dress. Sarah caught her breath. She kept this her whole life. Patricia said softly, "It sat on a shelf in her bedroom for as long as I can remember. When I was little, I asked her about it once. She told me it was very special and that it belonged to someone she loved very much. She never said more, and I didn't ask again." Sarah opened her laptop and showed Patricia the scanned image of the Harper family portrait. She zoomed in on the area beside the chair where the doll could be seen. Patricia leaned closer, comparing it to the doll on the table. They were exactly the same stitching, the same yarn hair, even the same small tear in the dress. "My God," Patricia whispered. She kept it from that day until she died. Sarah then shared everything she had uncovered. The fire, Margaret Sullivan, Thomas Harper's rescue efforts, the informal adoption, the community's quiet agreement to protect the family. Patricia listened as tears ran down her face, sometimes stopping Sarah to ask questions or clarify details. When Sarah finished, Patricia sat silently for a long moment, holding the doll gently in her hands. She was loved, she finally said, by 2 families, by her birth mother who made this doll for her, and by the Harpers who gave her everything else. Patricia later organized a family gathering and invited all of Anna's living descendants who were able to attend. 17 people gathered at Patricia's home in Cambridge. Grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and even 2 great-great-grandchildren were present, all connected to one orphaned girl and the couple who chose to save her. Sarah was invited to present her research. She spent weeks preparing a detailed presentation with photographs, records, and a timeline that followed Anna's life from the 1891 fire to her death in 1967. She also included historic photos of the Waltham textile mill and newspaper articles about the fire to help the family understand the tragedy that shaped Anna's early life. The room grew quiet when Sarah displayed the 1892 Harper family portrait on a large screen. Many of them had never seen it before. She zoomed in on the cloth doll beside the chair and then revealed the real doll that Patricia had preserved. Soft gasps filled the room. "Your great-grandmother Anna was born around 1887, Sarah began. Her birth name was Anna Sullivan. Her mother was Margaret Sullivan, a textile worker and widow who died in a boiler room fire on January 18, 1891. Anna was 4 years old. She explained everything she had discovered. The rescue efforts, Thomas Harper's role during the fire, the absence of orphanage records, the appearance of Anna's name in the Harper household 2 years later, and the photograph that recorded her new life. Thomas and Elizabeth Harper took her in privately, Sarah continued. This was not a legal adoption. Those were rare and costly at the time. They simply brought her into their home and raised her as their daughter. The community knew but respected their privacy. Anna was enrolled in school as Anna Harper. She grew up with James and Robert as her brothers. When she married in 1912, Thomas Harper gave her away as her father. Sarah showed census records that traced Anna's life, her marriage, her 4 children, and the decades she lived as a wife, mother, and grandmother. She lived to be 80 years old. She saw her children grow, her grandchildren born, and the beginning of her great-grandchildren's lives. The choice Thomas and Elizabeth Harper made in 1891 created all of this, Sarah said. Everyone in this room exists because 2 people decided that one orphan child mattered. An elderly man in the front row, one of Anna's grandsons, raised his hand. "Did she know?" he asked. "Did my grandmother know she was adopted?" Sarah paused. "Based on the evidence, I believe she did. Keeping the doll her entire life suggests she remembered her birth mother, but in that time, people did not talk openly about such things. She was raised as a Harper, and that became who she was. They gave her love, education, and stability. They didn't erase her past, but they allowed her to fully belong." Patricia stood and gently lifted the cloth doll so everyone could see it. "This is what my grandmother carried from one life into another," she said through tears. Her birth mother made it for her. The Harpers let her keep it, and she treasured it for 76 years. The evening ended with hugs, tears, and long conversations. Family members who had known Anna shared memories of her kindness, strength, and quiet dignity. Those who had never met her listened closely, slowly building an image of a woman whose early loss had been transformed by love into a meaningful life. Sarah later returned to the Boston Historical Society, feeling a deep sense of closure. The photograph that once seemed ordinary now held powerful meaning. She prepared a full archival report documenting every discovery, attaching copies of records, photographs, and interview transcripts. The report would be stored alongside the Harper family portrait so future researchers would understand the full story. With Patricia's permission, Sarah also did something rare. She had the cloth doll professionally photographed and documented, creating a companion piece to the portrait. The photograph and the doll would be displayed together, connected by the story of Anna Sullivan Harper Mitchell. The exhibit opened at the Boston Historical Society 3 months later, titled simply, beside the chair, "One Family's Act of Compassion." The enlarged portrait was displayed with the worn cloth doll in a nearby case. Text panels told Anna's story from the 1891 fire to her death in 1967, explaining informal adoption, industrial danger, and working class life in late 19th century New England. Patricia and several relatives attended the opening. They stood together in front of the image, studying the faces of Thomas, Elizabeth, James, Robert, and 5-year-old Anna, frozen in time on that November day in 1892. "They look so serious," one great-grandchild said, like they knew this moment mattered. Patricia nodded. Maybe they did. The photograph proved Anna belonged. The doll beside the chair showed where she came from and that her first mother loved her too. Sarah watched the family quietly, thinking of all the photographs stored in archives around the world. How many held stories like this? How many recorded quiet acts of courage that changed lives but left only small clues behind? The Harper family portrait was not important because of its artistic style. It mattered because of what it preserved, not just faces, but a choice. Thomas and Elizabeth Harper could have done nothing. Instead, they opened their home and their hearts. Anna, the orphaned daughter of a textile worker lost to fire, lived a full life because of that choice. She was loved twice, once by the mother who made her a doll, and again by the family who let her keep it. The photograph held both truths, and now, 132 years later, her descendants would remember not only the tragedy, but the love that saved her. The worn cloth doll, barely visible beside the chair, had finally shared its secret. Sometimes the smallest details carry the greatest truths, and ordinary people, in difficult moments, can change history one rescued child at a time.